The kingdom of Greyhaven lay under a sky of smoke and red dust where broken towers still leaned over streets full of ash and silence. Once, bells had rung there every morning and markets had been bright with bread, cloth, and music, but now only wind moved through the ruins. The people who were left lived in fear because the fall of the throne had not ended with fire alone. Strange shadows walked at night and every family knew the same hard truth. Something dark had survived the ruin and was still hunting for a way back into the world. Kael, a 20-year-old man with short black hair and tired gray eyes, had grown up in that ruin after losing his parents during the first attack on the capital. He worked as a runner and scavenger because he wanted only one thing: to keep his younger sister Mina safe in the shelter below the old east wall. Mina was a 14-year-old girl with long brown hair and a stubborn heart, and she mattered because she was the only family Kael had left. The central danger was simple and terrible. If the darkness rose again, Mina and every remaining life in Greyhaven would vanish into it. That was the fear that followed Kael every day, even before the blade found him. The blade came from a buried chamber under the broken palace, where Kael searched for supplies after hearing that old royal vaults still held food and medicine. There, in a room split by cracked stone and black scorch marks, he found an iron stand, a dead torch, and a sword wrapped in faded red cloth. The weapon was called the Void Blade by the old markings on the wall, and those markings warned that it had been made for the royal bloodline alone. Kael had no royal blood that he knew of, but when he touched the hilt, the air around him folded like torn cloth, and a thin black rift opened for one breath near the ceiling. Through that rift he saw a cold, endless place with moving lights like distant eyes. He dropped the sword at once, but the chamber shook and a whisper filled the dark. The blade was cursed, not because it wanted to hurt its bearer, but because it fed on fear, pain, and force of will. It could cut open small tears into the void for a brief moment, letting its holder strike with overwhelming power, yet every use would drain life from the body and make the void listen more closely. Kael did not understand all of that at first. He only understood that the blade had chosen him, and that choice had already drawn danger to his doorstep. When he carried the sword back through the streets, the first wraiths appeared. They were pale soldiers with broken crowns on their helmets, spirits born from the fallen throne, and they moved with empty eyes toward the blade as if they still served an order from long ago. Kael ran until his lungs burned, and only then did he see that these were not random ghosts. They were the guard of the old king, twisted by the throne into tools that now searched for the weapon that could wake their master. The cult found him 3 nights later. They came from the cathedral district where the fallen statues of saints stood black against the moon, and they wore ash-gray robes with red cord tied at the wrists. Their leader was Victor, a tall man with slick black hair, a sharp face, and calm blue eyes that never seemed surprised by anything. Victor spoke with the smooth voice of a teacher, but his words carried poison. He wanted the kingdom to break completely, because he believed a weak human realm could never survive the coming age. He and his followers planned to crown a demon emperor from beyond the void, a ruler they called the Ash Lord, because they thought only a demon could bring order from ruin. That was his motive, and it made cruel sense in the broken world he had chosen. He did not see the blade as a curse. He saw it as a key. Victor told Kael that the Void Blade had once belonged to the royal family, and that the throne had sealed a breach in the world using blood and sacrifice. Now that the seal was weak, Victor wanted Kael to open it fully. If he succeeded, the demon emperor would cross over and take the kingdom forever. Kael refused, and the cult attacked. Wraiths came with them, rising through broken walls and empty windows, while cult guards pressed in from the streets with iron rods and lanterns full of black smoke. Kael swung the blade in panic, and a rift opened in front of him. The void light flashed, the cult was thrown back, and the nearest wraiths split apart into drifting ash. But the blade burned his arm from wrist to shoulder, and Kael fell to one knee with his breath shaking. Victor only smiled because he had seen enough to know the sword truly worked. From that moment, Kael was no longer a scavenger hiding in the ruins. He was prey, and every force in Greyhaven now knew where to find him. Mina begged Kael to throw the sword away, but Kael could not. He knew that if the cult took it, the kingdom would be lost, yet if he kept it, the curse might consume him first. So he went to the one person who still understood the old court, a woman named Evelyn, a former royal scholar with silver-white hair, kind brown eyes, and a long dark cloak lined with stitched maps. She lived in a hidden library beneath a burned courthouse and spent her days protecting records that Victor had tried to erase. Evelyn explained the truth that changed everything. The blade had been forged not to serve the throne, but to stop the throne from being possessed. Long ago, the first king had heard the voice of the demon emperor through the void and had tried to use that power to rule forever. When the king began to lose himself, the royal guardians sealed the breach and hid the weapon, hoping that one day a person with enough courage could hold it without becoming a monster. That was the real reason the blade reacted to fear. It was testing the will of its bearer because the void would twist anyone who used it for greed. Kael listened in silence, and for the first time he understood why the sword had felt so heavy. It was not only metal, it was a warning. That same night, Victor struck again, this time sending wraiths into the lower shelter where Mina and dozens of other survivors hid. Kael reached the shelter just as the stone door cracked under the impact of cold hands and dead armor. He stepped between the children and the shadows, and fear almost made him drop the blade. Then he remembered Mina watching him, and he made a choice. He opened the rift wider than before. Black light spread along the sword, and for one impossible second, the air behind him turned into a silent storm of void energy. The wraiths rushed in, but Kael moved with sharp, fearless speed, and each swing shattered their shapes and forced them back. The cost came fast. His knees weakened, his vision blurred, and a deep cold crawled under his skin as if the void had placed a hand on his heart. Yet he held on long enough to save the shelter. The survivors did not cheer. They only stared because they had seen both rescue and danger in the same moment. Kael had become their shield, but he had also become something they could not fully trust. Victor, watching from the ruins outside, understood the deeper truth at last. The blade was not just awakening power in Kael. It was linking Kael to the void itself, and the more he used it, the closer he came to becoming the very breach Victor wanted to open. Kael realized the same thing, and the fear in his chest changed shape. He was no longer afraid only of losing his life. He was afraid of becoming the last disaster Greyhaven would ever know. Before dawn, Evelyn led Kael to the shattered throne room under the old palace, where the final seal still waited beneath cracked marble and fallen banners. There, carved into the floor, was the true shape of the curse, a circle of royal marks built to trap the demon emperor behind layers of broken space. Victor had been gathering wraiths to weaken that seal for months, and the blade in Kael's hands was the final piece he needed. Kael understood then that Victor had not hunted him simply for power. He had hunted him because Kael, as the last unbroken bearer of the royal weapon, could either restore the seal or tear it open forever. That was the twist hidden inside the whole tragedy. Kael had never been chosen to rule. He had been chosen to decide whether the kingdom would remain a prison for darkness or become its open gate. As the throne room shook, Victor stepped from the shadows with his cult behind him, and the wraiths rose in a ring around the broken hall. Victor smiled and reached out, promising Kael that if he surrendered, he would be spared the pain of resistance. Kael looked back toward the direction of the shelter, where Mina and the others waited in fear, and he finally understood what kind of man he wanted to be. He did not want the blade to make him strong for pride. He wanted it to make him steady for others. So he raised the void blade, took one slow breath, and opened a new rift into the darkness, knowing the next step would change everything, because the battle for Greyhaven was only beginning, and the cost of victory had not yet been paid. Greyhaven stayed quiet for only one breath after Kael opened the rift, and that silence felt worse than noise. Ash drifted through the broken streets, the blackened walls stood like tired giants, and the dark sky pressed low over the ruined capital. Behind Kael, far across the broken stone yard, Mina stood with the refugees near the shelter doorway, and her long brown hair moved in the hot wind as she kept her hands spread wide, ready to protect the frightened children behind her. Evelyn, the older woman with silver-white hair and calm brown eyes, stayed beside the shelter wall with a lamp in one hand and a stack of old notes in the other, because she alone had studied the void blade long enough to fear what it might do. Kael, lean and shaking, kept his gray eyes on the rift in front of him because he knew the darkness beyond it was not empty. Victor was still out there somewhere, and Victor had not come to save Greyhaven. Victor had come to open the city for the Ash Lord, the demon emperor who wanted fear, obedience, and a world where every frightened person would bow without question. The rift widened with a low crack, and cold black mist rolled out like smoke from a buried fire. Kael tightened his grip on the dark iron hilt, and the purple cracks along the blackened blade gave a weak pulse, as if the sword was listening to his fear. He remembered the choice he had just made, simple and clear, even if it hurt. He would not use the blade to prove he was special. He would use it to stay steady for the people behind him. That thought gave him enough strength to step forward as the first void creature came through. It was tall, thin, and wrong in shape, with long arms and a face that seemed half made of shadow. It moved fast, then stopped when Kael raised the blade. The sword flashed, the air split in a sharp line, and the creature was driven back into the rift. Kael did not cheer. He only breathed and stayed ready because he could already feel more shapes pressing close behind it. Then Victor walked out of the smoke as if he owned the ruin. He was tall, with slick black hair, pale skin, sharp cheekbones, and calm blue eyes that never seemed to blink too long. His ash-gray robes hung neatly from his shoulders, and red cord ties moved across his chest like small warning lines. He looked at Kael with cold interest, not anger, because Victor never rushed when he thought he was winning. He wanted the city for the Ash Lord, but he also wanted the Void Blade, because he believed the sword was a key that could open a full path between Greyhaven and the Void. If that path stayed open, the Ash Lord could send in an army of shadow beings and turn the Broken Kingdom into a gate for much worse things. Victor lifted one hand and spoke in a low, careful voice, telling Kael that resistance was already too late, that fear always broke people, and that power belonged to those willing to take it. Kael wanted to answer with anger, but Evelyn had warned him that Victor fed on panic and mistakes, so Kael forced his voice to stay even and said that Greyhaven was not for sale. For the first time, Victor smiled, because he liked hearing courage before he crushed it. The clash came fast. Victor raised both hands and bands of dark ash spiraled from the ground, curling around broken stones and shattered statue legs. Kael ran forward and sliced through one of the ash bands, then twisted aside as another swept past his shoulder and shattered against a wall. Mina, seeing the fight begin, moved the refugees deeper into the shelter, but she did not hide. She pulled two frightened children behind an old stone pillar, then returned to the doorway with a small iron rod she had found earlier, ready to block any creature that tried to slip inside. That made Kael more certain than ever that he could not fail here, because the people behind him were already acting brave in their own small ways. Evelyn opened her notes and called out a warning, telling Kael that the Void Blade could cut rifts, but every use pulled at his mind and made the darkness louder inside him. She also said Victor was not acting alone. The ash around his feet moved in the same pattern she had seen in old records about the Ash Lord, a ruler who never entered a place first, but always sent servants to soften a city until fear did the rest. Kael pressed harder and Victor answered with calm cruelty. He did not fight like a wild monster. He fought like a man who had spent years planning for this exact moment. Each move pushed Kael toward the rift, where the cold pressure made his knees shake. One slash from the Void Blade cut a narrow gap in the air, and for a split second Kael saw something impossible beyond it, a giant throne made of black stone, wide enough for an emperor, with a figure sitting still at the center like a shadow made solid. The sight hit him like ice. The Ash Lord was real, and Victor was not merely a local threat. He was a messenger, a servant, and maybe even a believer. That was the twist Kael needed to understand the larger horror. Victor did not want to rule Greyhaven for his own pride alone. He wanted to prove himself worthy of the Ash Lord, because the Demon Emperor had promised him a place in the New Order if he helped crack open the world. Kael nearly lost his balance at that sight, but Mina shouted his name, and the sound pulled him back. Her voice reminded him that real strength was not about standing alone. It was about staying connected when fear tried to split everyone apart. Kael changed his footing and turned Victor away from the shelter. He struck the ground with the blade, and a sharp wave of black light burst across the stones, forcing Victor to step back for the first time. The move cost Kael dearly because the sword drank at his calm and filled him with whispering pressure, but he held on. Mina saw the opening and hurled a lantern oil flask at the ash bands near the doorway. The glass broke, the fire flared bright, and the rolling ash retreated from the shelter entrance. Evelyn used the moment to chant from her notes, not a spell of attack, but an old sealing phrase that made the nearest void crack tremble. The effect was not strong enough to close it, but it slowed the creatures pressing through. Kael realized then that victory in Greyhaven would never come from one perfect strike. It would come from people working together, each one doing the part they could survive. That truth steadied him more than the sword ever had. Victor saw the shift and let his calm turn colder. He said Kael was making a child of himself by trusting weak people. Kael answered that trust was not weakness, and that the city was still full of people worth protecting. Those words mattered because they were the first time Kael spoke like the man he wanted to become, not like the scared boy who had taken the blade by accident. Victor lifted both hands again, and the smoke around the square tightened into a dark ring. From the edge of that ring came more void creatures, not many yet, but enough to overwhelm anyone standing alone. Kael put himself between them and the shelter, and Mina stood beside him without asking for permission. Her small frame looked fragile against the broken city, yet her eyes stayed bright and brave. Evelyn moved to the side to keep the refugees calm, and she finally told Kael the last part of what she had learned. The Void Blade had been made to open temporary paths, but it was also a lock. If Kael could find the source of the blade in the ruins below Greyhaven, he might be able to seal the main breach before the Ash Lord ever crossed into the world. That revelation changed the shape of the battle at once, because it meant Kael was not just surviving a fight. He was standing inside a larger trap that had been waiting for him all along. Victor raised his voice and called Kael a fool for listening, then pointed toward the center of the city where the fallen towers and broken roads led down into a sealed lower district. Kael saw the truth in that direction at last. The rift he had opened was not random. It had connected to a hidden path under Greyhaven, one the Old Kingdom had buried after the first signs of void corruption. If the path opened fully, the Ash Lord would have a doorway into the capital, and the whole ruined city could become the first step in a much wider takeover. Kael felt fear rise again, but this time he did not fight it by pretending it was gone. He accepted it, kept his grip firm, and looked at Mina, who gave him one quick nod. Then he looked at Evelyn, who closed her notes and stood ready. He understood that the next move could not be alone, and that made him stronger, not weaker. Together they pushed forward. Kael carved a narrow path through the ash, Victor stepped back into the smoke to call more darkness, and the shelter behind them stayed standing because Mina refused to let panic win. The first part of the battle for Greyhaven had changed from simple survival into a race toward the hidden lower city, where the real answer waited under the rubble. Kael did not know how deep the path went, or what the Ash Lord had already touched below the streets, but he knew the choice in his heart had already been made. He would not let the blade turn him into a monster, and he would not let fear turn him into a coward. Still, as the black smoke thickened and the rift gave one long shudder, a new shape began to form inside the darkness, and even Victor looked up in sudden caution because something far greater than his own power was starting to wake. The underground chamber under Greyhaven felt colder than the broken streets above, and the air carried ash, dust, and old fear in every breath. The black smoke from the widening rift rolled along the stone floor like a living thing, while broken pillars leaned over the chamber like tired guards that could no longer stand straight. Kael stood near the edge of the O-P-E-N Chinese letter, no, the edge of the rift. With his short black hair stuck to his forehead and gray ash streaked across his face, and even with his tired gray eyes shaking, he kept the void blade low instead of raising it. He was a lean young man in worn dark leather. A torn gray scarf and boots made for running, not heroics, and right now he wanted only one thing: to keep the blade from owning his will. Mina stood just behind him, small and tense in her patched blue coat. Her long brown hair pulled back and her bright worried eyes locked on Kael with fierce care. She wanted to protect him because she had seen too many people in Greyhaven become helpless in the face of fear. A few steps farther back, Evelyn watched with calm brown eyes from under the hood of her long dark cloak, her silver-white hair tied neatly at the neck, because she had spent years studying old ruins, old curses, and old warnings that others ignored. And in front of them all, Victor stood with his slick black hair, pale face, and ash-gray robes tied with red cords, his calm blue eyes lifted toward the rising shape in the smoke. He wanted power, order, and control, and he believed the Ash Lord could give him all three. The danger was now clear to everyone. If Victor succeeded, the Ash Lord would rise through the void and turn Greyhaven into the first prison of a much larger conquest. If Kael failed, the blade would keep opening rifts until the whole city sank into darkness. Then the smoke inside the rift thickened, and a huge shape moved behind it, slow and wide, like something waking after a very long sleep. Victor took one careful step back, but his voice stayed smooth and cold. He told Kael that fear had already chosen for him, and that the smart choice was to surrender the Void Blade before the Ash Lord tore the world apart. He spoke like a man giving advice, but every word was a trap. Evelyn answered first, her voice even and strong, and she told Kael and Mina that Victor was lying about control. She had found old records beneath the capital, and they told a simple truth. The Void Blade was never meant to command the Ash Lord. It was made to seal a breach after the first time the darkness tried to enter the world. The purple cracks along the blade were not signs of strength. They were signs of damage, and every time someone used it to cut open space, the seal weakened. That truth hit Kael hard because he had thought the sword was only dangerous because of the monster inside it. Now he understood that the sword itself was also a wound. Victor smiled when he saw that Kael understood because he believed understanding would lead to surrender. Instead, Kael tightened his grip and remembered the choice he had made in his heart. He would not become the kind of man who used terror as a tool. Mina moved closer to his side, not because she was strong enough to fight alone, but because she refused to let him stand alone. She told him that Greyhaven was already broken, but the people above were still alive, and they were counting on someone brave enough to act with a clear heart. That simple truth gave Kael more strength than the blade ever had. Then the chamber shook, and the shape inside the smoke answered Victor with a low sound that seemed to crawl through the walls. The Ash Lord did not appear fully, but his outline became clear enough for every person in the room to understand the threat. He was not a simple beast and not a mindless shadow. He was a ruler from beyond the void, and his power was built on fear, obedience, and the promise of safety that became a cage. Evelyn had learned that the Ash Lord did not destroy first because destruction was his only goal. He ruled by breaking hope and then offering only one path forward, which was surrender. That was why he needed Victor so badly. Victor had already ruined enough lives to know how to speak to frightened people, and the Ash Lord wanted a human voice that could open doors from the inside. Victor had convinced himself he could use that alliance for his own rise, but the truth was simpler and sadder. He was not training a monster, he was feeding one. As that truth settled in, the smoke formed wide shoulders, a horned crown, and a cloak made of drifting ash. The chamber grew heavy, and even the stones seemed to shrink away. Kael nearly lifted the void blade, but the sword pulsed with cold pressure, trying to pull his arm toward the rift. For one terrible moment, he felt how easy it would be to give in. One swing, one tear. One sharp opening into darkness. Then the blade could do the rest, and he would not have to choose. But he remembered Mina standing beside him, Evelyn trusting him, and the ruined streets above where families were hiding and hoping. He forced his hands still. That was the first real victory of the night. Victor saw Kael resist, and for the first time his calm face cracked with anger. He raised one hand, and the red cords at his sleeves glowed with a dark ember light as the chamber filled with harsh wind. Shadow bands snapped from the walls and whipped across the floor toward Kael and Mina, not as weapons meant to wound, but as chains meant to hold. Victor wanted Kael trapped in place long enough for the Ash Lord to finish crossing through the rift. Mina reacted instantly. She grabbed a fallen metal rod from the broken floor and slammed it into one of the cracked support stones, not to win a battle by strength, but to break the line of Victor and buy a second of space. The pillar split and crashed down between them, forcing Victor to retreat half a step. Evelyn used that same moment to step into the ring of smoke and throw a handful of pale chalk dust in a sharp circle. The old scholar markings glowed faintly because she had prepared them long ago for a day like this, when a seal would need to be slowed before it could be shattered. She shouted for Kael to look at the blade, not the monster. She told him the cracks on the steel matched the pattern of the rift, and that if he could turn the blade away from the pull of the void, he might close the wound instead of widening it. Kael heard her, and for the first time he understood that courage was not the same as force. Courage was choosing the harder path when the easier one tempted him every second. He planted his feet, ignored the drag in his arm, and pointed the blackened blade toward the center of the opening. The purple cracks along the edge brightened like warning lines in a storm. The Ash Lord answered with a surge of smoke that rushed toward Kael like a dark tide. The shape in the rift spread wider, and a deep voice rolled through the chamber, calm and terrible, promising order to anyone who would kneel. Victor looked up at that voice and realized too late that he was no longer speaking with a tool he could guide. The Ash Lord had no interest in sharing power. He had only been waiting for a hand strong enough to widen the door. Victor staggered in place, and that tiny shock of fear changed everything. His control slipped, and the shadow bands around the room weakened. Mina rushed to Kael and pressed her shoulder against his arm, not to move the blade, but to steady the man holding it. Evelyn kept her chalk circle glowing, her calm face tight with focus as she held the seal from breaking apart. Kael stared into the smoke and saw, for one brief instant, a face inside the darkness that looked almost human and far more patient than any beast. Then he understood the final lie of the void blade. It had never been calling him to power. It had been calling him to choose. If he used it for anger, the rift would feed on that anger. If he used it for fear, the void would pull harder. But if he used it with a clear heart, without hate and without greed, then the blade might obey its first purpose and close what had been opened. Kael drew one slow breath, thinking of Greyhaven above, of Mina beside him, of Evelyn trusting him, and of the many people who still believed ruins could become a home again. He pushed the blade forward with both hands, and the chamber erupted in a white burst of ash and light. When the light cleared, the rift had not vanished, but it had narrowed, and the smoke was no longer pouring out so freely. The Ash Lord was driven back for the moment, his shape breaking into thin streams that snapped into the dark air and vanished beyond the cracked ceiling. Victor fell to one knee, no longer calm, his pale face twisted in disbelief and anger. He had not lost everything, but he had lost control, and for a man like him that felt worse than pain. He looked at Kael with cold hatred and swore that this was not the end, because men like Victor never believe the first defeat is final. But the chamber had changed. The pressure in the air was lighter, the shadows less hungry, and the seal was holding just long enough to matter. Kael stood trembling, ash on his face and sweat on his brow, still gripping the void blade, yet no longer feeling like a prisoner of it. He had not destroyed the curse and he had not won a clean victory, but he had done something more important. He had kept his heart his own. Mina smiled through her fear and leaned against his shoulder for a second, relieved that he was still himself. Evelyn lowered her hand and studied the blade with new concern, because she now understood the next truth. The void blade could close the rift, but only if someone learned the full pattern of the seal, and that knowledge was hidden deeper in Greyhaven than any of them had reached so far. She told Kael that the chamber was only one lock, not the whole door. Somewhere below the ruined capital, another piece of the ancient prison still waited, and if Victor found it first, the Ash Lord would return stronger than before. Kael looked toward the darkness under the broken floor, and he knew the fight was not over. Above them, the city was still in danger. Below them, an older secret was waiting. And in the silence after the blast, a faint sound began to rise from the deep stone tunnels, as if something under Greyhaven had just heard the name of the Ash Lord and had begun to wake. Greyhaven still sat under its blanket of smoke, broken and quiet on the surface, while deep below it, stone tunnels carried every sound like a secret that refused to stay buried. The city had lost too much already, and everyone who remained in its ruined streets understood the same terrible truth, that one more mistake could open the way for the Ash Lord and let darkness rule the capital forever. Kael stood at the edge of the shattered floor, ash on his face, his short black hair damp with sweat, and his tired gray eyes fixed on the black opening below. He was a lean young man in worn dark leather clothing, with a torn gray scarf hanging from his neck, and fear still lived in his chest, but it no longer ruled him. Beside him stood Mina, a teenage girl with long brown hair, bright worried eyes, a small frame, a patched blue coat, and sturdy boots that were already dusty from the ruins. She wanted to protect the city and protect Kael, because she understood that courage meant staying when everyone else wanted to run. Behind them, Evelyn watched the dark opening with calm brown eyes, her silver-white hair tied back, her long dark cloak brushing the floor, and her scholar clothes layered for travel through cold stone. She knew more about the ancient prison than anyone else alive, and she had returned to Greyhaven because the prison was not just a legend to her. It was a warning, and Victor had already proven that he would use every warning as a tool. Victor was not far away. He stood on a broken ledge above a lower corridor, tall and still, with slick black hair, pale skin, sharp cheekbones, and calm blue eyes that never seemed to blink for long. His ash-gray robes with red cord ties moved like shadows in the drifting smoke, and his cold confidence made him more frightening than any loud threat could have done. He wanted the ancient prison piece below the city because he believed it was the last lock on the path to the Ash Lord. Victor did not think he was bringing ruin, he thought he was guiding the future. He believed fear was the only true force in the world, and if the Ash Lord returned, people would obey instead of fight, and the world would become orderly at last. That was his motive, simple and terrible, and it explained why he kept pushing deeper into danger while the city cracked around him. The strange sound from below rose again, low and hollow, like something large had shifted in its sleep. Kael did not need anyone to tell him what it meant. The hidden prison still held something alive, something tied to the Ash Lord, and if Victor reached it first, the balance would break. Evelyn raised one hand and pointed toward a narrow stair cut into the stone. She said the lower tunnels were built by the first keepers of the prison, long before Greyhaven had become a capital, and that the sound they heard might be the seal chamber itself answering the name of the Ash Lord. Mina swallowed hard, but she stepped forward anyway, because stopping now would mean letting Victor choose the fate of the city. They moved fast through the broken stair and into the older underworld beneath Greyhaven, where the air turned cold and damp, and the walls carried carved marks that looked like warnings and prayers mixed together. The deeper they went, the more the tunnels changed. New stone gave way to ancient brick, then to huge blocks blackened by old fire, and every turn showed signs that this place had been built to last longer than kingdoms. Kael walked in front, void blade held low in his right hand, its dark iron hilt cold and heavy, the blackened steel blade showing faint purple cracks along the edge. The cursed sword felt restless, and every time he gripped it, a thin ripple of wrongness trembled in the air, as if the weapon wanted to tear a small opening into the void again. Kael hated that feeling, but he also knew the blade was tied to the prison, and tied to Victor, and maybe even tied to the Ash Lord himself. Evelyn noticed his unease and finally told the truth he had feared. The void blade was not just a weapon made to cut through armor. It had been forged from prison metal, shaped from the same dark seal that held the Ash Lord back. The blade could open brief rifts into the void because it was designed to test the prison, repair cracks, and, if used wrongly, awaken what it was meant to hold. That was why Victor wanted it, and that was why Kael had been chosen to carry it. He was not the master of the blade. He was the one forced to decide what it should become. Soon they reached a wide chamber where the tunnel ceiling had collapsed long ago, leaving jagged stone ribs overhead and a deep pit in the center of the floor. On the far side stood Victor, already there, one hand lifted toward a tall stone gate wrapped in chains of dark metal. The gate was carved with a circle of runes, and inside that circle, faint red light pulsed like a slow heartbeat. Victor had found the last seal first, and that small advantage made the chamber feel even more dangerous. Around him stood two ash-touched sentries, ruined figures dressed in broken gray armor, their faces hidden beneath cracked helms. They were not mindless beasts. They were people Victor had promised power and protection, then twisted with the force of the prison. They served him because he made them believe order mattered more than mercy. When Victor saw Kael, he smiled with calm satisfaction, as if the world had finally arrived where he expected it to be. He said the city above was already too weak, and the old prison below was the only honest thing left in Greyhaven. He said the Ash Lord would return, not as a rumor, but as a ruler who could end chaos forever. Mina shouted that he was insane, but Victor only answered that fear makes people truthful and truth makes them obedient. Then he touched the runes, and the chamber shook hard enough to send dust pouring from the ceiling. The stone gate cracked open just enough for a blast of hot wind to surge through, carrying the smell of ash and old metal, and with it came the waking sound they had heard before, now louder and sharper, like something huge turning in chains. A deep shape moved beyond the gate, hidden in darkness, and even Victor took one slow step back before he hid the motion behind his calm face. Evelyn looked at the markings and understood the real twist, the one that changed everything. The ancient prison had not only been built to trap the Ash Lord, it had also been built to split his power into pieces so that even if one seal failed, he would not return in full. That meant the piece Victor wanted was not just a lock. It was a fragment of the Ash Lord himself, preserved so the prison could hold the rest. If Victor joined that fragment to the blade or broke the seal the wrong way, he would not simply free a ruler. He would strengthen the darkness that had been sleeping for centuries. Kael felt the weight of that truth hit him all at once, and for the first time, he understood that his fear had been part of the trap. Victor had been counting on people being afraid enough to accept any answer that promised control. Mina moved to Kael's side, not because she was fearless, but because she was brave enough to stand beside his fear. She told him they did not need to win by force alone. They needed to stop Victor from making the wrong choice, even if that meant trusting the blade one more time. Kael stepped forward into the red glow, and the void blade answered with a thin pulse of purple light. The air split for a moment, opening a brief rift that showed a cold, endless dark beyond the chamber, and the ash in the room spun like frightened birds. Victor raised his hand and tried to force the seal wider, but Evelyn called out the old words she had spent her life studying, the words that told the prison how to close when the keeper still had the will to command it. She had not come just to watch history repeat itself. She had come because she knew the prison accepted truth as much as bloodline or power, and she knew Kael had enough will left to speak back to it. Mina held the broken chain loose from the floor, using all her strength to keep Victor from reaching the center rune, while Kael turned the void blade sideways and drove its dark edge into a second engraved line hidden under the dust. The sword screamed without a sound, and the chamber answered with a violent shudder. A wave of force threw Victor back from the gate, and his ash sentries stumbled as the red light began to crack apart. Victor did not fall apart with them. He stared at Kael with a cold, new anger, because he finally saw that Kael was no longer the frightened boy from the city streets. Kael had become a keeper of the seal, whether he wanted that title or not. The gate began to close, but not before a deep voice, distant and august air in its calm, rolled through the stone from beyond the darkness. It was the Ash Lord, waking just enough to speak through the ruin of the prison, and the voice said that the seal had been touched, the game had begun, and the next opening would be larger. Then the chamber slammed shut again, sealing the voice away, but not before everyone heard it clearly. Victor smiled in the dark, because even driven back, he had learned something useful. The prison was still alive. Kael was connected to it. And the next time the door opened, the fight for Greyhaven would reach a far darker level than before. When the tremors finally slowed, silence returned in broken pieces. Dust drifted down from the ceiling, the red glow faded to a weak ember, and the ancient chamber stood scarred but still standing. Mina rushed to Kael first, her hands checking his shoulders and scarf as if she could prove he was real and still with her. Evelyn leaned on her staff and studied the sealed gate with a grave face, because she understood that they had won only one small moment, not the full battle. Victor was gone from the center floor, vanished into a side passage during the chaos, and that fact mattered more than anything, because he was still moving, still hunting, and still certain that the Ash Lord could be used. Kael stared at the dark gate and felt the change inside himself more clearly than he expected. He had begun this journey as someone trying not to lose what little he had left. Now he understood that protecting Greyhaven would require more than survival. It would require trust, patience, and the courage to face truths that did not feel good. He looked at Mina, at Evelyn, and then at the void blade in his hand, and for the first time he saw that he was not standing alone in the dark. He was standing with people who had chosen hope even when fear was easier. Above them, Greyhaven still burned under smoke and broken stone, and somewhere beyond the sealed chamber, Victor was already planning his next move. Below the city, another secret still waited, deeper than this one, older than this one, and the final sound from the tunnels had not been the last warning. It had been only the first answer from the dark, and Kael knew the next descent would change everything again. Greyhaven lay under a black sky of smoke, broken towers, and drifting ash, and the ruined capital looked like it was holding its breath. Fires still flickered in far streets, but their light could not reach the deep places under the stones. Down in the hidden chamber, Kael stood with the people who had stayed beside him, and he could feel how fragile that choice was. Mina stood close by, her long brown hair tied back in a rough knot, her bright eyes wide but steady, and her small frame tense as if she were ready to throw herself in front of danger. Evelyn, the older scholar, kept one silver-white hand on a stack of old notes, her calm brown eyes moving over every face as she tried to keep the group from breaking apart. Near the broken archway, Victor had already slipped away into the dark beyond them, his slick black hair and pale face still clear in Kael, less as a memory than as a warning. Victor wanted the hidden power under Greyhaven because he believed fear was the only true law, and he wanted to rule the coming darkness before it ruled him. Kael knew that if Victor found the next secret first, the whole city could fall into a trap older than any wall or tower. That was the simple truth now. The city above was wounded, the tunnels below were open, and the Ash Lord, the feared ruler from beyond the void, was no longer just a story told to scare children. He was a coming force, and every sign said he was reaching for this place through the cracks in the world. The group did not have the comfort of rest. One of the lower stone doors had not fully closed after their last clash, and cold air kept coming through the crack as if the underground itself were calling them forward. Kael looked at the void blade in his hands, the dark iron hilt rough against his palm and the blackened steel blade marked with faint purple cracks. He hated how much he needed it, because every time the sword answered him, the edge of the air seemed to thin around the blade. Even standing still, it made the shadows shiver. Evelyn had explained the rule in a low voice before they moved. The sword could open brief rifts into the void, but each use made the hidden passage between worlds weaker, and that was exactly what the Ash Lord wanted. If the void opened too wide, the darkness would not stay outside their world anymore. It would step in. That was why the sword mattered, and that was why Victor wanted it so badly. He thought the blade could be used like a key to command the buried power below Greyhaven, Kael thought Victor was wrong, but he also knew Victor was clever enough to be dangerous. Mina looked at the sword with fear, then at Kael with trust, and that look did more to steady him than any speech could have done. She wanted to protect the people still trapped in the ruined capital, and she refused to leave even when the road ahead looked hopeless. Evelyn wanted the truth because she had spent years studying old signs, old seals, and old warnings that most people had ignored. Now the warnings were real, and she carried the guilt of knowing she had not understood them soon enough. Together, the three of them stepped down into the next passage, while behind them the chamber fell into a tense silence as if the stone itself was listening. The new tunnel was narrower than the first, with damp walls, broken pipes, and old carvings worn almost smooth by time. Their light revealed names cut into the stone by hands long gone, and beside those names were symbols that looked like folded wings and closed eyes. Evelyn knelt to study them, her voice soft but urgent as she told the others that these marks belonged to the old builders of Greyhaven, people who had sealed something under the city long before Victor was born. She said the first kings had buried a gate because they feared what came through it, and they had used the void blade only once to lock it in place. Kael listened, and a new fear settled in his chest. This was not just a hidden room or a forgotten treasure. This was a prison. Mina asked the question that mattered most, her voice small but brave. What was inside the prison? Evelyn did not answer at once. She touched the stone, and her calm face became heavier with memory. She said the prison was built for a voice that did not belong to this world, a voice that promised power, safety, and control to anyone willing to obey it. That voice had a name now in old records and in fear alike, the Ash Lord. He was not just a monster of fire and smoke. He was a ruler from beyond the void who fed on surrender, and he could not fully enter unless someone opened the way with a willing heart or a broken seal. Victor had found the first chamber because he wanted that power for himself, and now he was racing toward the deeper seal, hoping to bargain with the Ash Lord instead of fighting him. Kael felt anger rise inside him, but he also felt something else. He understood Victor a little better now. Victor was not chasing chaos for fun. He was terrified of being weak, and that terror had become greed. He believed control would save him, and that belief was making him blind. The danger was no longer a mystery. It was a choice between trusting one another or letting fear make their decisions. They moved deeper, and the tunnel opened into a wide hall under Greyhaven, where old pillars leaned like tired guards and a cracked floor stretched toward a sealed door of black stone. The door was covered in purple light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat, and the air around it felt wrong in a way that made Mina wrap her arms around herself. Victor was already there, standing before the door with two armored followers who had chosen his side because they believed his calm face meant safety. His posture was relaxed, his blue eyes cold and sure, and his voice was almost gentle when he spoke. He told Kael that the city was already broken, that hope was only a mask people used when they were too weak to face the truth, and that he alone could use the power below to build order from the ruins. Kael answered him with simple truth. The power below was not order, it was a trap. Victor smiled as if he had heard a child speak. Then he raised one hand and the black stone door shuddered. The old seal was weakening, and the pressure behind it was strong enough to make the floor tremble. Kael realized the next secret was not a treasure room at all. It was the chamber that held the final binding of the Void Gate. If Victor broke it, the Ash Lord would have a clear path upward. Mina stepped beside Kael without hesitation, even though her knees were shaking, and Evelyn called out that the markings on the wall were changing. The seal was reacting to the void blade. It recognized the sword as both lock and key. Kael gripped the hilt harder, his fear and determination fighting inside him because he finally understood why he had been drawn here. The blade had not chosen him to destroy the darkness by force. It had chosen him to decide how much of the darkness the world could survive. The chamber began to awaken before anyone could move. Lines of purple fire spread across the floor, and the sealed door opened just enough for a heavy wind to pour through. It was not a normal wind. It carried whispers, promises, and a deep cold that made the skin crawl. The shape of the Ash Lord did not fully appear, but his presence reached through the crack like a hand through cloth, and even Victor took one sharp step back. For the first time, his calm face tightened. The thing behind the door was larger than his ambition, and he knew it. The whispers offered him command, safety, and a kingdom that would never challenge him again. Kael saw Victor hesitate, and that hesitation was the clearest proof that Victor was still human enough to fear what he had called upon. Then Victor made his choice. He reached for the crack in the seal, hoping to grab control before the Ash Lord pushed through. That was the twist none of them had expected. Victor had not intended to serve the Ash Lord from the beginning. He had intended to bargain with him, believing he could use the Demon Emperor as a weapon and remain above him. But the whispers grew louder and the floor cracked wider, and the chamber answered to a power that did not care about Victor at all. Mina shouted for Kael to act, and Evelyn shouted that the blade had to be turned, not swung. Kael finally understood. The void blade could not simply strike the seal. It had to be placed into the old lock and then turned with will, trust, and sacrifice. One wrong move could open the gate farther. One steady move could close it again, at least for now. Kael stepped toward the door and the whole chamber seemed to hold still around him. Victor lunged at the same time, his controlled mask gone now, replaced by raw panic. The two men collided in a harsh clash of leather, stone, and steel, and Victor drove Kael back with a sudden burst of force from the crack in the seal. Mina rushed in without thinking, using her small size and quick steps to pull Kael away from the widening light. She was brave not because she felt no fear, but because fear did not stop her. Evelyn shouted the final instruction, her voice clear over the rising wind. Kael had to trust the sword, trust the seal, and trust the people beside him. That was the real test, not strength, trust. Kael forced himself up, bloodless and shaken but still standing, and he jammed the void blade into the old lock as the purple cracks along the edge flared bright. The chamber screamed with sound, a deep and terrible noise that shook dust from the ceiling and sent Victor stumbling backward. The black stone door slammed shut a moment later, sealing the worst of the breach, and the wind cut off as if a giant mouth had been closed. Victor fell to one knee, staring at the blade with a look that mixed anger, fear, and reluctant respect. He had not won, but he had also not been destroyed, and that made him even more dangerous. The chamber was safe for the moment, yet the seal was not healed, and the whispers had already left a mark in the air. When the trembling finally eased, Kael did not feel triumphant in the easy way people do after a victory. He felt changed. He had entered the tunnels afraid of the dark and afraid of failing the people who depended on him. Now he understood that fear would always be part of the path, but it did not have to lead the way. Mina touched his arm, and her relieved smile told him that she saw the change too. Evelyn studied the sealed door and said the old prison had been delayed, not destroyed. The Ash Lord was still there, still waiting, still listening. Victor vanished into a side passage before anyone could stop him, and his retreat carried a warning of its own. He would not give up. He would search for another way to turn the void to his favor, and that made the next part of the journey even harder. Above them, Greyhaven still burned under smoke and broken stone, and people in the streets still needed rescue, food, and a reason to keep going. Below them, the deeper secret of the city had not gone silent. It had only been delayed. Kael looked at Mina, then at Evelyn, then at the dark passage ahead, and he made a choice that was larger than fear. He would keep going, but not alone, and not for power. He would go because the city needed someone to stand between the living world and the thing beneath it. In that moment, Kael became more than a frightened survivor. He became the one who would lead the next descent, even if the dark was waiting with open hands. The air beneath Greyhaven felt colder now, and the stone walls seemed to listen. High above, the ruined city still stood under a sky of smoke and ash, but down in the tunnel chamber the world had become small, hard, and quiet. Broken arches leaned over cracked black floors, old symbols curled across the walls, and purple light leaked through the sealed black stone door like a weak pulse. Kael stood at the front, with Mina close at his side and Evelyn behind them, and all three could feel the same truth pressing on them. The secret under Greyhaven had not ended. It had only waited for the next person bold enough or foolish enough to continue. Kael was scared, but he was no longer running. Mina, a teenage girl with long brown hair, a patched blue coat, and brave, worried eyes, wanted to protect him and prove she was not just a frightened helper. Evelyn, an older woman with silver white hair, calm brown eyes, and layered scholar clothes under a dark cloak, wanted the truth to stay buried unless it could save lives. And Victor, the cold man in ash-gray robes with slick black hair and sharp blue eyes, wanted the prison open so he could use what slept below for his own power. That was the heart of the danger. If the seal failed, the thing beneath Greyhaven would not just wake in legend. It would reach into the living world and make fear into a chain. Kael turned from the dark passage and looked at the others with tired gray eyes that still held a new fire. He was a young man with short black hair, a lean body, worn dark leather clothing, and a torn gray scarf that hung over ash on his face. He had looked frightened for most of this journey, and he still was, but now his fear had a purpose. He held the void blade with care, a cursed sword with a dark iron hilt, a blackened steel blade, and thin purple cracks along its edge. The blade had already opened brief rifts into the void, and every time it did, Kael felt its pull trying to bend his will. He knew now why the old builders had sealed this place. They had not built a prison just for a monster. They had built it to hold back a gate. Evelyn stepped closer and spoke in a calm voice that carried without force. She said the symbols on the walls were not warnings for treasure hunters, they were instructions for guardians. Long ago, the old builders had hidden this chamber below Greyhaven because they feared the void blade could be used to open the prison from the inside. Victor had not simply come to steal an object. He had come because he believed the Ash Lord could give him rule over every frightened person in the city and beyond. His motive was simple and terrible. He wanted order through fear, and he believed fear was easier to command than trust. Mina clenched her small fists and said she would not let a man like that make the world kneel. Kael listened, and for the first time since all this began, he did not feel alone inside his own mind. They moved toward the black stone seal door, and the chamber seemed to grow tighter with every step. The purple lines on the door shifted softly, as if something behind it was breathing in slow, deep pulls. Evelyn studied the old symbols carved around the frame, and her scholar training showed in every careful movement. She explained that the seals were linked to three things. First, the chamber itself had to stay closed. Second, the blade had to remain out of the lock pattern. Third, the one who carried the blade had to resist its hunger long enough to choose what to do with it. Kael swallowed hard because that last rule felt like a trap built for him alone. Mina noticed his hands shaking and touched his sleeve for a moment, giving him strength without speaking. Then, from deeper in the passage behind them came the slow sound of footsteps on stone. Victor appeared under the broken archway with the same calm face he always wore, as if he had not rushed at all. Two hooded men moved behind him, silent and tense, but Victor alone mattered. He was the only one who looked certain. He said Kael had done well by finding the door for him, and he spoke as if the chamber itself belonged to his plan. Then he explained his logic with cold patience. Greyhaven was already broken, the people were already afraid, and fear always created control. If he could bind the Ash Lord to his own command through the Void Blade, then no kingdom, army, or rebel could stand in his way. His words were not wild, they were careful, which made them worse. The chamber broke into motion. Mina grabbed a fallen iron rod from the floor and moved to block the narrow path, her small frame steady and her bright eyes full of resolve. Evelyn raised one hand and began to trace the old symbols in the air, using the seal text like a map. Kael stepped forward with the void blade, and the blade answered with a low tremble that climbed through his arms. Victor smiled because he had been waiting for that reaction. He told Kael the true twist of the chamber, the part Evelyn had feared most. The blade was not only a key, it was also a lure. The Ash Lord had learned, through long pressure and old magic, how to whisper through the cracks and call to anyone who held the cursed sword long enough. Victor had not come only to open the prison. He had come because he believed the Ash Lord would choose him as the strongest hand in the room. That was the revelation that changed everything. Victor was not chasing a tool. He was trying to become the first servant of a coming ruler, hoping the demon emperor would reward him with control. Kael felt anger rise through his fear, because Victor wanted to turn every life in Greyhaven into a broken thing beneath his rule. The hooded men rushed Mina, but she struck the rod against the stone and forced them back. Evelyn shouted for Kael to keep his focus on the seal, because the door was beginning to move. Purple light spread wider across the black stone, and a deep crack opened along one side. Cold wind spilled out from behind it, carrying whispers that sounded almost like voices calling names. Kael nearly lost his grip on the blade when those voices touched his mind. He saw flashes that were not memories and not dreams. He saw a vast black throne, a sky without stars, and a figure made of shadow and fire waiting beyond a broken gate. The Ash Lord did not appear as a simple beast. He felt like a ruler who had never accepted being shut out. He wanted obedience, silence, and endless fear because fear made people easier to bend. Kael understood then why the old builders had hidden the prison beneath a ruined kingdom instead of in a temple or tower. They had buried it under a place that could be abandoned if needed, and they had used the weight of stone, symbol, and sacrifice to keep the gate from opening. But the seal was now failing, and Victor was feeding it with greed. Evelyn found the final line in the wall carvings and called out the only way to stop the chamber from fully opening. The blade had to be turned inward, not toward the lock but toward the crack itself, while someone else spoke the sealing words in the old tongue. Mina shouted that she would hold Victor back, and she did, even as he tried to push past her with cold, sharp force. Kael looked at her, then at Evelyn, and he understood that being a leader did not mean standing alone. It meant trusting others with fear still in your chest. He set his jaw, stepped toward the crack, and drove the void blade into the glowing line of the seal. The chamber shook hard enough to throw dust from the arches. Purple light burst outward, then folded back on itself like a snapped ribbon. Victor shouted in rage as the rift opened for a single terrible moment, but instead of letting the Ash Lord through, Kael forced the blade to turn the surge back into the door. Evelyn spoke the sealing words with clear, steady power, and Mina held her ground against Victor long enough for the ritual to complete. The black stone door slammed shut with a force that echoed through the chamber and up into the dark city above. Victor was driven back across the broken floor, his calm mask finally cracking. He stared at Kael with real anger now, because the boy he had dismissed had become the one thing Victor could not control. The seal still glowed, but the lines were steadier now, and the whispering behind the door had faded to a distant hiss. The danger was not gone, and everyone knew it, yet Greyhaven had not fallen tonight. Kael stood breathing hard, the void blade still warm in his hand, and he felt something new settle inside him. He was still afraid, but he was no longer ruled by fear. Mina looked at him with pride and relief. Evelyn gave a small nod, as if she had just seen the first true step of a long path. And beyond the black stone sealed door, deep in the chamber of old builders, something ancient and angry waited in silence, now aware that the next descent had already begun. Greyhaven stayed quiet above the broken streets, but the silence felt wrong now, like the city itself was holding its breath. Ash still drifted through the night air, and the smoke over the ruined towers glowed faintly under the moon. Far below the blackened walls in the Greyhaven tunnel chamber, the last clash had ended, yet the danger had only grown clearer. Kael stood near the sealed door with the void blade in his hand, his short black hair damp with sweat, his tired gray eyes fixed on the purple lines crawling across the black stone. He was a lean young man in worn dark leather clothing and a torn gray scarf, with ash on his face and a look that mixed fear with hardening resolve. Mina, the teenage girl with long brown hair, bright worried eyes, a small frame, a patched blue coat, and sturdy boots, stayed close beside him, ready to protect him even when her own hands were shaking. Evelyn, the older woman with silver white hair, kind brown eyes, a slim build, a long dark cloak, and layered scholar clothes, watched the seal with calm focus, because she knew the old signs carved into the chamber walls better than anyone alive. And somewhere deeper ahead, Victor was moving toward them, calm, patient, and sure that the prison below was waiting for him. Victor had a cold, confident face, pale skin, sharp cheekbones, and slick black hair that never seemed out of place, even in the ash and ruin. He wore ash-gray robes with red cord ties, and he moved like a man who had already won in his own mind. Two hooded men followed him through the chamber, silent and careful, their dark clothing hiding most of their faces as they obeyed every small motion of his hand. Victor wanted the power sealed beneath Greyhaven, and he wanted it for a reason that was simple, clear, and terrible. He believed the world above was weak, divided, and doomed to break under fear, so he meant to open the Void Gate and call the Ash Lord closer. The Ash Lord was not just a rumor now. He was a demon emperor from beyond the void, a ruler Victor hoped to serve before others could stand against him. Victor did not seek chaos for its own sake. He wanted control, and he believed the Ash Lord would give him a world ruled by obedience, silence, and terror. That was why the seal mattered so much. If the door opened fully, the prison would weaken, the old barrier would fail, and something ancient and angry would begin to reach through. Evelyn stepped closer to the wall carvings and brushed ash from one broken symbol with two careful fingers. Her face stayed calm, but her eyes grew more serious as she followed each line in the stone. She told Kael and Mina that the old builders were not simple workers from a forgotten time. They were the hidden founders of this underground prison, and they had built the chamber long before Greyhaven rose above it. They sealed the Void Gate because they had seen what it could invite into the world. They did not trust kings, warriors, or priests with that knowledge, so they buried it under layers of stone, warning marks, and traps. The purple light leaking from the black stone sealed door was not a sign of power waiting to be claimed. It was a sign that the prison was under strain. Evelyn also explained the rule that made the chamber so dangerous. The seal did not only keep something out, it also held something in. If the wrong blood, force, or void power touched it at the wrong time, the lock would react and the prison would answer by opening a path in pieces. That was why Kael carrying the void blade mattered more than anyone yet understood. The blade could open brief rifts into the void, and every use of it spoke to the same force that the old builders had feared. Kael listened, and for the first time he understood that his fear was not the real enemy. His fear was only the way the enemy found him. He had already survived because he had stopped running from himself, but now he needed to choose what to do with the blade in his hand. Mina saw that change happen in his face and she stepped closer, her brave expression steadying his own. She had always protected him, but she did not want him to remain weak just because he had once been frightened. She wanted him to stand up, look straight at the dark, and keep moving. Then a low sound rolled through the tunnel, and the black stone-sealed door answered with a faint shiver. The purple lines brightened and dust fell from the cracked arches overhead. Victor had reached the inner side of the chamber, and his voice drifted through the dark, calm and measured, as if he were speaking in a quiet room rather than standing at the edge of a buried prison. He told them that they were still too late to stop the truth. He said the old builders had made one mistake because they feared the void but never understood how much the world above would beg for power when it grew desperate. He claimed that Greyhaven had already been broken by cowardly rulers, and that only a stronger master could unite what remained. Mina looked at Kael, then at Evelyn, and then back at the seal, and she understood the real danger first. Victor was not trying to smash the door, he was trying to make Kael open it for him. That was the trap inside the trap. The void blade responded to the same void lines in the seal, and Victor knew that if he pushed Kael into panic, the blade would react without care. That would create the brief rift he needed. Kael saw the truth only a moment later, and the understanding hit him like cold water. Victor had followed them all this way not just to attack, but to steer. He had waited through the first clash, watched Kael use the blade, and learned how the young man fought when fear came close. Now Victor wanted to use that fear against him. The two hooded men slipped around a cracked pillar on Victor's signal, each one carrying a black iron rod etched with red marks. They did not charge. They spread out, blocking the narrow path and cutting off the easy road back. Their job was not to win quickly. Their job was to make the chamber feel smaller, tighter, and impossible to leave. Evelyn raised her hand and spoke a few old words in a quiet, steady voice. The carvings on the wall answered with a soft pulse, and part of the chamber floor clicked open with a heavy stone sound. A line of old builder light ran beneath the dust, revealing a narrow, safe path that curved around the broken center stones. She had found a route the old builders left for those who came after, and she told Kael to trust the markings instead of the panic. He looked at the void blade, then at the seal, then at Mina, and something inside him settled into place. He was still afraid, but he was no longer hiding from that feeling. He moved beside Mina and matched his breathing to hers, slow and careful. Together they advanced along the safe path while Evelyn stayed just behind them, reading the chamber as if it were a living thing. Victor noticed at once. For the first time his calm face tightened. He had expected fear, delay, and confusion. He had not expected Kael to choose trust over panic. That small choice changed the shape of the whole moment. Kael did not swing the void blade at the seal. He held it low, turned the hilt toward the stone, and let its dark edge hum without releasing a full rift. The blade trembled, then settled as if it recognized a stronger will guiding it. Victor lifted one hand and the hooded men moved in at once. Their black rods struck the floor, sending sharp violet sparks across the chamber stones. The safe path shook and loose rocks slid from the broken arches above. Mina rushed forward first, not because she was reckless, but because protecting Kael had become part of her courage. She shoved one hooded man aside with a hard shoulder strike and kept him from reaching the blade. The other hooded man tried to cut off Evelyn, but the older woman stepped back with surprising speed and slammed her staff against a wall rune, causing a burst of pale light that staggered him long enough for her to escape the strike. Kael saw that the battle was not about strength, it was about time. Victor wanted only one clear moment, one tiny mistake, one pulse of void power at the seal. Kael understood that and did the one thing Victor had not prepared for. He spoke to Mina and Evelyn, told them to trust him, and then he forced himself to look directly at the door without flinching. The fear was still there, but it no longer held the wheel. He raised the void blade not to attack but to listen. At once the blade answered with a low purple glow and the sealed door reacted in kind. The old symbols on the stone flashed in a pattern Evelyn recognized at last. Her eyes widened, and the surprise on her face told everyone the truth before her words did. The black stone seal door was not only a prison lock, it was also a warning map. The old builders had hidden a message in the symbol pattern, and that message was meant for someone who carried void power without fully serving it. Evelyn shouted that the seal could be stabilized, but only if the blade was placed against the correct rune before Victor completed his chant. That was the twist buried in the chamber, the thing none of them had expected. The weapon Victor wanted to use as a key was also the only thing that could hold the prison shut. Victor heard her and finally lost the calm edge he had worn so carefully. His voice sharpened, and he ordered the hooded men to rush forward. The chamber filled with movement, violet sparks, and the sharp sound of stone grinding under pressure. Kael stepped toward the seal, Mina at his side, Evelyn guiding each motion with urgent words, and Victor behind them, furious now that his plan had started to slip. Yet even with the chamber shaking and the purple light climbing the walls, Kael did not retreat. He planted his boots, lifted the void blade to the rune Evelyn marked, and felt the old prison begin to wake. What answered from the other side was not peace and not yet a full breach, but a deep, heavy presence that pressed against the stone like a fist from the dark. The next descent had already begun, and Kael knew, with a calm that felt new and frightening, that the true door below Greyhaven was only now starting to open. Greyhaven sat under a dirty sky, and the ruined capital looked like a city that had forgotten how to breathe. Broken towers leaned over ash-covered streets, fallen statues stared with cracked faces, and black smoke drifted low across the rooftops like a blanket that never lifted. Deep beneath that broken world, under damp stone and old silence, the underground chamber kept its secret for a long time, and that secret now began to wake. Kael stood at the center of it all with ash on his face, short black hair damp with sweat, tired gray eyes fixed on the black stone seal door, and a torn gray scarf hanging from his neck like a flag after a hard fight. He was lean, worn down, and afraid in the way that honest people are afraid, but he had also crossed a line that fear could not pull him back over. Mina stood close behind him, a small teenage girl with long brown hair, bright worried eyes, a patched blue coat, and sturdy boots that were already dusted with ash. She wanted to protect Kael, protect Evelyn, and protect the last safe people left in Greyhaven, because she knew that if the seal failed, no one in the city would stay safe for long. Evelyn stood beside them in her long dark cloak, an older woman with silver-white hair, kind brown eyes, layered scholar clothes, and the calm face of someone who had spent her life reading warnings that others had ignored. She knew the old builders had made this prison for a reason, and she knew the reason was now pressing against the door like a giant hand from the dark. The danger was clear now. If the seal opened the wrong way, the Ash Lord would not need an army to conquer Greyhaven, because fear itself would become his weapon and every living mind in the city would bend. Victor wanted that power. He had entered the chamber for control, for rule, and for the cold pride that made him believe he could stand above everyone else. He came forward now with slick black hair, pale skin, sharp cheekbones, calm blue eyes, and ash-gray robes tied with red cords, looking less like a fighter and more like a judge who had already made up his mind. Behind him, two hooded men moved in silence, both hidden in dark clothing, both cautious and obedient, following his every gesture without a word. Victor raised one hand, and the hooded men stopped at the edge of the glowing lines that ran across the stone floor. The purple light on the black stone seal door grew stronger, and the old symbols carved into the chamber walls began to shimmer as if they remembered the touch of the void blade. Kael still held that cursed sword in both hands. Its dark iron hilt felt cold and alive, and the blackened steel blade carried faint purple cracks along the edge like a wound that never closed. Evelyn had marked a rune near the center of the seal, and Kael had pressed the blade there without looking away. That choice had changed everything. The prison had answered, not with peace and not with a clean opening, but with a deep, heavy presence that pushed back through the stone, slow and strong, as if something huge had turned over in its sleep. Now the chamber trembled in short waves, and the broken arches overhead dropped dust in thin gray curtains. The air turned damp and bitter, and the purple lines on the door pulsed once, then twice, like a heart trying to remember its own rhythm. Kael swallowed hard because the calm inside him had become strange and sharp. He was still frightened, but the fear no longer ruled his hands. It only made him more careful. Victor saw that change and smiled without warmth. He wanted Kael to doubt himself because Victor understood that a person with fear can still be pushed, but a person with purpose is harder to break. "You touched it," Victor said in a quiet voice that carried through the chamber. Good. Now let it open for me. Mina turned toward him at once, anger flashing across her face. She stepped in front of Kael, small but steady, and she planted her feet like she had already decided she would not move. Evelyn lifted one hand and warned her to stay calm, but her eyes never left the seal. She knew the true problem was not just the door. The old builders had used a second lock, one that did not sit on the stone but on the memory of the prison itself. To break the seal carelessly would not only release what was inside, it would also wake the ancient force that answered to fear, and that force would search for the strongest will in the chamber and try to use it as a bridge. Victor wanted that bridge. He had spent years studying hidden seals and ruined records because he believed the power below Greyhaven could let him command nations through dread. He had not come to destroy the Ash Lord. He had come to bargain with him, or perhaps to wear his shadow as a crown. Kael did not fully understand that yet, but he understood enough to know that Victor was not there by accident. The hooded men fanned out slowly, their boots scraping the stone, and one of them carried a bundle wrapped in black cloth. Evelyn noticed it at once. "Do not let him use the anchor," she said, her voice still calm but tighter now. "If that object meets the seal, the prison will answer faster." Kael looked toward the bundle, and Victor noticed the glance. That was when the twist began to show itself. The thing under the cloth was not a weapon, but a key, a carved shard of the original seal, stolen long ago from the records of the old builders. Victor had not found the prison by luck. He had found pieces of the past, one at a time, and he had followed Evelyn and Kael because he needed the void blade to join them all. He had expected to force the prison open and seize whatever lived beyond it, but the prison was more dangerous than even he had guessed because it did not only hold a monster, it held a warning. As the chamber shook again, the far wall near the seal door split with a thin line of purple fire, and for one sharp moment, Kael saw carved figures hidden inside the stone. They were the old builders, shown kneeling in a ring around a tall shape that looked less like a demon and more like a man wearing a crown of smoke. Around that figure, the carvings showed faces with closed eyes, and above them all, a symbol of a hand covering a door. Evelyn stared at the carving, and her calm broke just enough for everyone to notice. "No," she whispered. "That is not a prison picture, that is a warning record." Mina looked from the carving to Evelyn, confused and scared. Evelyn answered at once because the truth could no longer stay hidden. The old builders had not only sealed the Ash Lord away, they had also locked part of his voice inside the chamber walls so that anyone who sought to use the prison would hear him first. That voice would not sound wild or cruel at first, it would sound patient, it would sound helpful. It would sound like a promise that fear could be ended if only one person agreed to hold the power. Kael finally understood why his blade had been drawn here. The void blade was never meant to simply open doors. It was a tool made by the same forgotten hands that built the prison, a blade that could cut a brief path into the void so the builders could lock the gate from both sides. That was why the sword felt hungry, and that was why it pulled toward the seal. The sword did not only open, it also remembered how to bind. Victor heard the explanation and his face hardened at last. He had wanted a throne made of shadows, but now he realized there was a second choice in the chamber, one that could destroy his plan if Kael found the courage to use it. "Enough," Victor said, and his voice turned cold. He lifted his hand, and the two hooded men moved. One rushed toward Evelyn, trying to take her attention, while the other swung the black cloth bundle toward the glowing seal. Mina reacted first. She darted forward with surprising speed, grabbed the man's wrist, and drove him off balance with all her strength. The bundle fell across the floor and slid toward the door. Kael stepped in before Victor could reach it, and for a few hard seconds the chamber became a blur of motion, shouting, scraping boots, and purple light. Kael did not fight like a trained soldier. He fought like a tired young man who had finally chosen what mattered most. He used the void blade to cut a narrow slash of darkness across the air, and the brief rift knocked one hooded man backward without hurting him. The force of it sent ash into the air and made the chamber lights flicker. Victor moved with perfect control, calm even in conflict, and he caught Kael in a sharp strike that forced him back against a broken arch. Pain shot through Kael, but he did not fall. Mina pulled Evelyn away from the swinging blade of the second hooded man, and Evelyn shouted a line from the old records, words so old they sounded like stones rubbing together. The seal answered her voice. The purple lines on the black stone seal door shifted into a different pattern, and the heavy pressure behind the stone suddenly changed. It was not just awakening. it was listening. Kael saw it then, and the second revelation struck him hard. The prison was not only holding the Ash Lord out, it was also holding something in. The deeper force pressing against the door was not the demon emperor himself, but the first lock of the prison, an ancient will left behind by the old builders to judge any hand that tried to open it. If that will accepted Kael, the door might open safely. If it rejected him, the chamber could collapse inward and bury every hope of reaching what waited below. Victor knew none of this, and that ignorance made him dangerous. He lunged for the fallen shard, but Mina kicked it away before he could grab it. She was breathing hard now, fear and courage mixing together in her face, yet she stayed between Victor and the seal. Evelyn reached the carving on the wall and placed her palm on the old symbol of the covered door. Her silver-white hair caught the purple light, and her calm voice became very clear. "Kael," she said, the builders left one answer. "The blade must not force the seal, it must choose it." Kael looked at the sword in his hand, then at the trembling door, then at Mina and Evelyn fighting to hold the line. He understood at last that his fear had never meant he was weak. It only meant the choice was real. Victor stood straight again, his blue eyes hard with cold certainty, and the chamber around them shook as the deep presence behind the stone pressed once more, stronger than before. The next move would decide whether Greyhaven held its secret, or whether the prison opened its mouth and began to speak. Kael took one slow breath, raised the void blade, and stepped toward the seal as the purple light climbed higher across the walls. The underground chamber beneath Greyhaven felt smaller with every breath, as if the stone itself was leaning in to listen. Purple light moved across the cracked black walls in slow waves, and the old symbols carved by the hidden builders glowed like eyes in the dark. Dust drifted through the cold air, and the broken arches overhead cast long shadows that trembled with each shock from below. Kael stood near the black stone sealed door with the void blade raised in both hands, and even now, with fear tight in his chest, he understood the truth more clearly than ever. If the seal failed, the prison under Greyhaven would open and the Ash Lord would return through it. That was the real danger. That was why Victor had come here. Victor did not want power in the usual way. He wanted control through fear, and he believed the Ash Lord could give him a world where everyone obeyed. Mina stood several steps behind Kael, small and tense in her patched blue coat, her bright eyes fixed on the door as if she could protect the whole chamber with her stare alone. Evelyn remained beside a broken pillar, her silver-white hair tied back neatly, her calm face drawn with worry as she studied the symbols like they were speaking a language only she could hear. The two hooded men stood near Victor, silent and alert, their faces hidden, their hands ready, waiting for orders from the man who had brought them all into this trap. Victor smiled without warmth, and his calm blue eyes stayed fixed on Kael as if the boy were already making the right mistake. He was tall and sharp in his ash-gray robes, the red cord ties at his chest swaying lightly as the chamber shook again. His voice was quiet, but every word landed hard. He said the seal was failing anyway, and the old builders had only delayed the truth. He claimed the prison had been made to hold back a force too great for weak rulers, and that every kingdom after Greyhaven had only survived by pretending that truth was not there. He wanted the Ash Lord awake because he believed fear would bring order, and order would end the endless wars that had left the land broken. That was his logic, cold and clear, and it made him far more dangerous than a madman. Kael heard the promise inside those words, and he hated it because part of the promise was easy to understand. Fear could stop fighting. Fear could silence chaos, but fear could also swallow everything good. Mina heard it too, and she stepped forward with her jaw set, telling Victor that a world built on terror was just another prison. Victor only glanced at her, almost amused, as if she were too small to matter. Evelyn, however, lifted one hand and spoke in a steady voice that cut through the shaking air. She said the old builders had not created the prison to hide a weapon. They had built it because they had seen what the void could do when a ruler tried to use it for control. The door was not a treasure chest, it was a warning. That warning became clear the moment Kael lowered his gaze to the void blade. The blackened steel blade pulsed with faint purple cracks, and the dark iron hilt felt warm now, almost alive. Kael had never wanted the sword. He had carried it because there had been no one else who could hold it when the first seal was found, and because every time the sword opened a brief rift, it seemed to choose him again. That was the curse of it. The blade answered fear, doubt, and desire, and it could open a path into the void for only a moment before the tear snapped shut. Evelyn had told him the rule in the first chamber long ago. The sword did not create power from nothing. It borrowed from the space beyond the world, and every use made the boundary thinner. That was why the seal and the blade were linked. The door recognized the sword. The old builders had made it that way on purpose because they feared that someday someone would try to force the prison open with the one object that could speak to the void. Kael swallowed hard as he remembered that lesson. Then the chamber lurched again, and a deep thrum rose from below the stone. The pressure behind the seal was stronger now, almost like a giant hand pressing up from the dark. Purple lines raced across the black stone seal door, and one of the carved symbols split with a sharp crack. Mina gasped. Even Victor narrowed his eyes. The prison was not just waking, it was listening. Kael took one careful step toward the door, and the void blade answered with a low hum that made his arms tremble. He could feel the pull from the seal, the same pull that had haunted him since the beginning. It was not only fear. It was also the strange temptation of being important, of being the one person who could reach across the line no one else could cross. That was the trap Victor understood so well. He had not come only to open the prison. He had come to push Kael into choosing the blade over his own heart. Victor lifted one hand, and the two hooded men moved at once, spreading out to block the side paths of the chamber. One of them carried a chain wrapped around his forearm, while the other held a small iron lantern with a dark flame inside it. They did not speak, but their bodies were tense and trained. They were not wild thugs. They were followers who believed Victor had a future worth serving. That made the fight more dangerous, because belief can keep people moving long after fear should stop them. Mina saw the movement first, and she darted to Kael's side, placing herself between him and the nearest hooded man. She was afraid, but she did not back away. Evelyn moved too, reaching into the folds of her layered scholar clothes and pulling out a stack of thin stone tablets covered in old marks. She had spent years studying the hidden builders, and now she began matching the marks on the tablets to the symbols on the door. Her hands shook, but her mind stayed sharp. She called out that the seal had 3 locks, not one. The first was the outer stone. The second was the oath of the builders. The third was the will of a living bearer who could refuse the void. Kael heard that last part and understood the meaning at once. The blade alone was not enough. His choice mattered. The prison could only be opened if he gave in. That truth struck him harder than Victor had expected, and it changed the air in the room. Kael looked at the door, then at Mina, then at Evelyn, and he felt the weight of every step that had led here. He had once thought bravery meant acting without fear. Now he knew better. Bravery was staying when fear had every reason to win. It was protecting people when the easier path was to hand the world over to something cruel and call it peace. Victor saw the change in him and lost some of his calm for the first time. His voice sharpened as he told Kael that weakness had already ruined Greyhaven, and only a strong ruler could bring it back from ruin. He said the old kingdom had fallen because it trusted hope instead of power. He said the Ash Lord would not hide in the dark forever, and that someone would open the door eventually. That someone could be Kael, and if Kael refused, someone else would take his place. Victor believed that mattered. He believed history always belonged to the strongest hand. Kael answered by planting his feet and telling Victor that fear was not the same as strength. The words were simple, but they came from deep inside him. The chamber seemed to still for one breath. Then the seal flashed brighter, and a thin line of purple light cut across the door like a crack in glass. One hooded man rushed toward Mina, but she struck his wrist with the flat of a broken stone rod, and the iron lantern dropped and rolled across the floor. Evelyn shouted for Kael to hold the blade steady, because the seal was reacting to his fear and his choice at the same time. In that moment, the last hidden truth of the chamber came into view. The carved symbols on the walls were not only warnings, they were a map. The old builders had hidden a second chamber below the first prison, and the chamber was designed to draw the void away if the seal ever failed. Evelyn realized it just as the purple lines began to spread toward a broken arch on the far side. She raised her voice and told Kael that the builders had planned for betrayal long ago. They had known someone like Victor might come. They had built a fail-safe, but it required the seal door to be touched by the void blade in a very exact way. Kael understood that this was not a command to open the prison. It was a command to redirect the pressure before it burst outward. The prison was not simply a locked room. It was a machine of old faith, old fear, and old sacrifice. Victor heard enough to understand the danger to his plan, and his face finally hardened into open anger. He shouted for his hooded followers to stop Kael before the choice could be made. One moved toward him, but Mina rushed in first, shoving the man back into a pillar with surprising force for someone her size. The other hooded man flung his chain wide, and the metal snapped across the air as the chamber shook again. Kael lifted the void blade higher, feeling the sword drink in the light from the seal. He could sense the thin edge of the rift beginning to form, a narrow wound in the air just above the black stone. The pull was strong, but now he knew what it wanted. It wanted him to surrender. He would not. He forced his breathing steady, took one slow step to the left, and set the blade against the symbol Evelyn had pointed out. The purple light flared so bright that everyone had to turn their eyes away. The seal groaned. The chamber walls rumbled. Somewhere deep below, the presence behind the stone pushed once more, stronger than before, and the hidden prison seemed ready to answer. Kael held on, Mina held her ground, and Evelyn shouted the next word of the old builders as the chamber began to open in a new and dangerous way, leaving everything hanging on the edge of what would happen next. The chamber beneath Greyhaven shook like a beast trapped under stone, and the air turned cold enough to sting. Ash drifted through the broken arches, and the purple lines on the black stone seal door began to glow like living veins. Kael stood in the center of the room with his torn gray scarf hanging loose, his short black hair damp with sweat, and his tired gray eyes fixed on the seal as if looking away would let it win. Mina stayed close beside him, her long brown hair falling across her patched blue coat, her bright worried eyes wide, and her small body braced like she could hold the whole chamber in place by force of will. Evelyn stood a little behind them, silver-white hair catching the purple light, her kind brown eyes calm even as the walls groaned. Victor watched from the far side of the chamber with cold blue eyes and a smooth face that never lost its calm, while his two hooded men stood near him like quiet shadows. The danger was now simple and terrible. If the prison below opened too far, the thing sealed inside would not stay buried, and Greyhaven would become the gate through which the Ash Lord could return. Evelyn kept her hand raised and shouted the next old word again, even though the sound was almost lost under the deep rumble of stone. She was not yelling at the door alone. She was speaking to the builders who made the seal, to the old rules hidden in the wall, and to the fear that had kept the prison locked for generations. Kael could not understand every word, but he understood the strain in her voice. She wanted to keep the seal from tearing apart because she knew the prison was not only holding a monster below. It was also holding back a flood of dark force that could spread through the city and into every broken street above. Mina looked at Evelyn with faith and fear together because she trusted the older woman more than anyone else in the room. Victor, however, smiled as the chamber shook because he had not come to save anyone. He wanted the seal broken just enough for him to reach the power inside, and he believed that fear itself could be turned into a weapon if the Ash Lord woke under his command. Then the chamber gave a heavy lurch and a line of purple light split wider across the black stone. A deep voice rolled up from below, too low to be a human voice, too old to be a normal sound. The floor trembled under Kael's boots, and one of the broken stone rings around the seal cracked loose and fell aside. Mina flinched but did not step back. Instead, she moved closer to Kael as if she had decided that being near him was better than standing alone. Kael felt the weight of the void blade at his side, the cursed sword hidden under the dark leather he wore. Its blackened steel blade seemed to hum in answer to the light from the seal. He hated that feeling. He hated that the sword always seemed to know when the prison below was waking. Evelyn saw the way it reacted, and her calm face turned serious in an instant. She told Kael that the blade was not just a weapon. It was a key made from a broken promise, and every time it stirred, it pushed the seal closer to opening. Kael had never wanted that sword, but he had carried it because no one else could bear its pull. Now he understood that the void blade was not only dangerous in his hands. It had been made for this prison, and maybe for this exact moment. Victor stepped forward at last, his ash-gray robes moving like smoke around him, and he spoke with a voice that was quiet, clear, and full of cold control. He said he did not fear what waited below because fear was the one thing he knew how to use. He said the old builders were cowards who buried power instead of shaping it. He said Greyhaven had rotted because weak people clung to broken walls instead of taking what the world offered. Then he raised one hand and the two hooded men moved. One of them carried a chain wrapped around a heavy iron spike, while the other held a small stone charm that glowed with dim purple sparks. They were loyal because Victor promised them power, and they followed him because he had already shown them that he could make fear feel like obedience. When they stepped toward the seal, Evelyn shouted for them to stop, but Victor only gave a small nod, and the hooded men drove the iron spike into one of the cracked floor marks. The chamber answered with a violent shudder. Kael felt the ground jerk under him, and Mina cried out as dust rained from the ceiling. Victor had just used the old marking of the builders to force the prison to open from the wrong side. That was the twist Evelyn had feared, and now she finally spoke it aloud. The chamber was not simply a door. It was a lock made from two choices. One choice would keep the Ash Lord sealed, but only if the right words were spoken in the right order. The other choice would wake the prison and turn its energy into a bridge. Victor had learned enough from stolen notes to know part of the order, but not all of it. He was gambling that the prison would break under pressure and let him take what lay below before anyone else could stop him. Kael stared at him in disbelief, because until now Victor had looked like a man who wanted control. Now he looked like a man willing to tear open the world to get it. Mina realized the same thing and moved in front of Kael on instinct, her small frame tense and ready. She was brave not because she was not afraid, but because she was terrified and stayed anyway. Evelyn lowered her voice and told them the second truth. The old builders did not create the prison to hide a treasure. They built it to trap a ruler who fed on surrender. The Ash Lord did not only conquer lands. He entered minds, twisted trust, and made people invite darkness into their own hearts. That was why the prison mattered so much. If it opened fully, the city above would not just face an enemy. It would face a fear that could spread from person to person until no one trusted anyone at all. The next surge from below struck harder than the last, and a wall segment near the seal cracked with a sound like thunder under stone. The black door shifted inward by a narrow space, just enough for a thin ribbon of purple mist to spill into the chamber. It curled over the floor like a living thing, and every person in the room felt the pressure in it. Kael felt his chest tighten. Mina's hands trembled, but she still did not retreat. Evelyn reached into her layered scholar clothes and pulled out a flat bone tablet covered in tiny marks, a piece of the builders left for the last keeper of the seal. She had kept it hidden because she was not sure anyone else could be trusted with it, and now that choice mattered more than ever. She told Kael that the seal would only hold if someone accepted the burden of the final word, the word that made the prison remember why it existed. Kael understood the meaning even before she finished speaking. Someone had to stand close enough to the opening to speak the word clearly, while the others protected the chamber from Victor and his men. It was a terrible choice, because the closer a person stood to the prison opening, the stronger the pull from below became. Victor saw the same opening and made his move. He threw back one hand, and the hooded men rushed toward the center, trying to break through Mina and reach Evelyn. Mina stepped forward with a fierce, protective look that did not match her small frame, and she drove one shoulder into the first attacker just hard enough to throw him off balance. The second hooded man raised his stone charm, but Kael lunged in, grabbed the man by the wrist, and slammed him back into a cracked pillar. The man collapsed to the floor, stunned, while the charm skittered across the stone and vanished into drifting ash. Victor did not panic. He simply watched, calm as ever, then turned his blue eyes toward Kael with a look that said this was all expected. He told Kael that heroes always protected broken cities, and broken cities always needed someone stronger to rule them. Kael almost answered, but then the void blade at his side pulsed again, and the purple cracks in its edge lit up in a sharp line. For one brief moment, a narrow tear formed above the blade, and through it Kael saw not the chamber, but a vast dark place below the world, crowded with moving shadows and a distant shape like a throne made of smoke. Evelyn saw the tear and immediately understood the last piece. The void blade was not only reacting to the prison. It had once been used by the old builders to guide the final lock. The blade could open a path, but it could also close one if the holder knew the true pattern. That was the reason the sword had been drawn to Kael in the first place. He had survived its pull because he never fully trusted it, and that caution made him different from Victor. Victor wanted power without limits. Kael wanted the people beside him to live through the night. That difference changed everything. Evelyn told Kael to hold the blade steady and listen to her words. Mina kept herself between Victor and the center, her breathing fast but her eyes locked forward. The chamber roared again, and the black door opened another handspan. Purple mist flooded wider, and inside that mist a shape seemed to move, large and waiting. Victor smiled at the sight because he believed he was finally close. Then Evelyn shouted the next builder word, and Kael answered by raising the void blade with both hands. The blade flared, the purple crack ran from hilt to tip, and the chamber went still for one breath. In that breath, the seal began to change, not closing and not fully opening, but shifting into a new pattern that no one in the room had seen before. Kael felt the pull on the blade turn against his grip, and he knew the prison had recognized him. The floor under his feet split with a hard crack, and a ring of dark light rose around the seal. Mina shouted his name, and Evelyn reached for the bone tablet as the old marks on the wall ignited one by one. Victor took one step back, his calm expression finally breaking into open surprise because the chamber was no longer obeying him. The prison was reacting to Kael, to the blade, and to the last words of the builders. A deep voice from below pressed against the stone again, but this time it sounded less like a threat and more like a warning. The seal was not simply opening, it was testing who had the right to stand before it. Kael held on with both hands, ash on his face, fear in his chest, and a hard new focus in his tired gray eyes. Mina stood ready beside him. Evelyn kept speaking the old words with fierce control. Victor watched the new pattern form, and for the first time he looked uncertain. Above them, Greyhaven still burned under smoke and ruin, but beneath it, the prison had chosen a new path, and no one yet knew whether that path would save the city or lead it into the hands of the Ash Lord. The black stone chamber under Greyhaven trembled like a beast that had just opened its eyes, and dust slid from the broken arches in slow gray streams. Purple light pulsed along the sealed door, then crawled through the carved symbols like fire trapped inside stone. Kael stood near the center with both hands locked tight, his short black hair damp with sweat, his tired gray eyes fixed on the new pattern as if looking away would let the chamber swallow them all. Mina stayed close beside him, her long brown hair falling over her patched blue coat, her small frame tense and ready, because she understood that if Kael failed, the prison would not stay quiet for long. Evelyn stood a few steps back, her silver-white hair glowing softly in the strange light, her calm brown eyes steady even as she spoke the old words with clear force. Victor remained near the far side of the chamber, tall and still in his ash-gray robes with red cord ties, his slick black hair neat and his pale face hard, while the two hooded men behind him watched in silence. The danger was simple now, and everyone knew it. If the seal broke in the wrong way, the path below Greyhaven would open wide and the Ash Lord would have a road into the city above. Kael could feel that truth in his chest like a stone, and for the first time, fear and purpose were standing together instead of fighting each other. He was no longer just trying to survive the night. He was trying to keep a kingdom from falling into the hands of a ruler who fed on panic and control. Evelyn changed the rhythm of her voice, and the chamber answered with a low, deep hum that traveled through the floor and into the bones of everyone present. The old builders had left the seal with layers, not one lock but many, and each layer had to be touched in the right order or the prison would shift into a new danger. Evelyn knew this because she had studied the carvings for years in hidden records that others ignored, and because her life had been spent searching for the truth behind Greyhaven before the city was ever burned. She had once believed the seal was only a legend, a warning made to scare greedy rulers, but now she knew it was real, and she knew why it mattered. The old builders had created the underground prison to hold a void gate, and they had hidden the black stone seal door so that no easy hand could ever find it. They feared not only monsters, but also people like Victor, men who wanted power more than peace and would gladly break the world if it gave them control. Kael listened while the words continued, and he saw the reason for the old design in a sudden flash of understanding. The prison was not built to keep something simple inside, it was built to keep something clever out. Victor saw the same opening in his own way, and his calm blue eyes sharpened with interest as he watched the purple lines shift. He did not want Greyhaven saved. He wanted the prison, the seal, and the fear it could create in the hands of a man who knew how to bend a crowd. One of the hooded men stepped forward, then stopped when Victor raised a hand. That small motion told Kael everything. Victor was waiting for the right moment, not because he cared about patience, but because he cared about winning. Then the chamber changed again, and the first real surprise struck them all at once. The black stone seal door did not crack open, and it did not collapse. Instead, it turned, slowly and with dreadful purpose, until one hidden ring of symbols faced the light. A hidden chamber map spread across the wall in glowing purple lines, and within it Kael saw a shape he did not expect. The void gate was not below the seal as everyone had assumed. It was tied to the seal itself, woven into the door like a knot tied by a master hand. Evelyn turned her head sharply, and for the first time her calm face showed clear alarm. If the door was opened fully, the prison would not simply release what it held. It would choose who controlled the release. That was the twist hidden by the old builders, and it made the danger far worse than anyone had feared. The prison was a test as much as a lock. It could answer a voice, follow a command, and open its path toward the strongest will in the chamber. Victor understood this before anyone else, and a cold smile touched his mouth. At once he began to speak in a measured tone, saying that order was needed, that his hand could guide the seal better than a frightened boy and an aging scholar. Kael felt Mina tense beside him, and he knew she was ready to fight if Victor lunged. But Victor did not move yet. He only planted an idea because that was how he worked. He wanted Kael to doubt himself. He wanted Evelyn to tire. He wanted the seal to choose him by force of will. Outside the chamber, far above their heads, a distant roar rolled through Greyhaven, and more ash drifted down from the broken city. The burning streets were still dangerous, but now the greater threat lay under their feet, where the prison was listening. Kael had never felt so divided inside himself. Part of him wanted to step back and let Evelyn carry the burden because she knew the old words and had the strongest mind in the room. Another part of him wanted to grab the void blade where it rested near the seal, because its blackened steel and faint purple cracks had already shown that it could cut through barriers that normal tools could not touch. But the blade was cursed, and everyone knew it could open brief rifts into the void if used with the wrong intent. That power might help them, or it might hand Victor the final opening he needed. Mina saw the struggle on Kael's face before he said a word. She stepped closer, her bright, worried eyes locked on his, and her brave expression softened with trust. She told him, in simple words, that he did not have to be perfect. He only had to stay with them. That was enough to steady him. Evelyn then gave Kael a task that mattered. She told him to hold the blade only long enough to match the seal, then release it when she spoke the final line. She did not ask because she was weak. She asked because the seal reacted to clear intent, and Kael had the same raw fear as the prison itself. Fear, when held honestly, could become a shield. Kael reached out, took the void blade, and felt a cold pulse run through his hands. The air around the edge darkened, and for a brief moment he saw a small rift tremble open, showing a place that was not stone, not fire, and not light. He almost let go, but Mina stayed beside him, and Evelyn spoke with unwavering control. Together they formed a steady pattern, and the purple lines on the black stone sealed door answered with a deep glow. Victor finally stepped forward, his voice quiet and smooth, telling them they were making a mistake. Then the two hooded men moved too, each one raising a hand toward the seal as if waiting for a hidden command. The chamber tightened. The air grew cold, and the prison, awake at last, began to choose a side. At that instant, Evelyn gave the last phrase of the old builders, and the sealed door flashed so brightly that all four figures flinched. The glow did not break the door, but it pushed back the purple haze long enough for everyone to see the truth carved beneath the symbol ring. The old builders had left a final warning. The prison could only be mastered by a group that held the seal together, never by one greedy hand. That was why the hidden design had resisted Victor. That was why Kael and Mina had survived long enough to stand here. It was not strength alone. It was shared resolve. Victor realized this at the same time Kael did, and his calm mask finally slipped. Anger sharpened his face, and he snapped a command at the hooded men. They rushed in, not with wild violence, but with a fast and desperate attempt to split the group apart before the seal could lock into place. Mina moved first, not to win a clean fight, but to protect Kael from the side. She shoved one hooded man back with all her weight, and the other missed his mark when Evelyn slammed her staff against the floor and sent a sharp wave through the chamber. Kael lifted the void blade, and the edge sang with a dark sound as it cut a thin line through the purple light, not opening a full rift but forcing the seal to hesitate. That pause was enough. Evelyn shouted for Kael to match the symbol with his fear, not against it. He understood at last that the chamber was not asking him to be fearless. It was asking him to be honest. So he took one steady breath, looked at the burning image of Greyhaven in his mind, and accepted that he was afraid because he cared. The seal responded. The black stone door locked into a new pattern, and the purple lines spread into a wide circle that wrapped around the room. Victor was forced back 2 steps, his robes snapping in the wind of the seal, and the hooded men stumbled to a stop as the chamber rejected their push. For one brief, hard moment, Kael stood at the center of the answer. But the victory did not feel safe because the prison was not finished. Deep behind the black stone sealed door, something vast pressed against the other side, and a voice like distant ash rolled through the stone. It was not a full arrival, but it was close enough to chill every breath in the room. The Ash Lord was hearing them now. That was the terrible truth no one could hide from anymore. He was not only waiting in some far-off darkness. He was listening through the void gate, testing the lock and learning the shape of their resistance. Victor heard that same voice, and instead of fear, he showed hungry interest. He had wanted to bargain with power all along, and now he knew the Ash Lord might answer a deal if it gave him a path to rule the broken city. Kael saw it clearly at last. Victor did not merely want control of Greyhaven. He wanted a place beside the darkness because he believed fear was the only true law. Mina tightened her grip on Kael's arm and looked up at him with a new kind of trust, one that asked him to keep going even when the answer was not finished. Evelyn, breathing hard now, told them the seal had held, but only for the moment. She said the old builders left one final chamber above the door, and if they could reach it, they might find the last method for closing the prison forever. The problem was simple and serious. They had won this step, but the path ahead was still open, and Victor was still in the chamber with them. The hooded men had pulled back, yet not from defeat. They were only waiting for their master to decide the next move. Kael looked at the seal, then at Mina, then at Evelyn, and he understood that the next part of the journey would be harder than this one. He had started the night as a frightened young man clinging to a blade. He was ending it as someone who could stand in the center of fear and not break. Above them, Greyhaven still burned, and below them the prison still listened. And somewhere beyond the black door, the Ash Lord waited for the smallest mistake while Victor gathered his thoughts for another betrayal. Greyhaven burned above the broken stone, and ash drifted down into the tunnel chamber below. The air felt wet, cold, and heavy, and the black stone seal door shone with purple lines that pulsed like a heartbeat. Kael stood near the center of that light, with Mina close at his side and Evelyn watching the old carvings, while Victor waited near the edge with two hooded men behind him. The prison was awake now, and everyone there knew one wrong move could open the way for the Ash Lord. Kael was no longer only a scared young man clutching a blade. He was a fighter now, still afraid, but no longer ruled by fear. Mina, a brave teenage girl with long brown hair and a patched blue coat, held her ground because she believed Kael could still choose the right path. Evelyn, an older scholar with silver-white hair, studied the seal because she alone understood the old signs of the old builders. She saw the truth first, and her calm voice made it plain. The door was not a prison for the weak. It was a lock for something that fed on trust breaking apart. Victor smiled when Evelyn spoke because his plan was never only to serve power. He wanted the Ash Lord to rise through the void gate, but he also wanted the world to blame someone else when it happened. Years ago, the old builders had trapped the gate beneath Greyhaven, and Victor had found a way to use the void blade to crack its rules. The blade could open brief rifts, but each one gave the prison a chance to answer. Victor needed Kael to strike the seal and finish what his own hands could not. Then he turned on his allies, ordering the hooded men to move, and the chamber erupted into a tense clash of steel, light, and shouting shadows. Kael did not run. He stepped between Victor and the seal, and that choice changed everything. Mina pulled one hooded man away from the door, while Evelyn spoke the final warning from the carvings. The seal did not want blood or sacrifice. It wanted a bond strong enough to hold. Kael understood at last that the prison had been waiting for a protector, not a warrior, and he placed his hand on the glowing stone without flinching. The purple light surged, the rift snapped shut, and Victor was driven back as the void blade cracked in his grip. When the chamber went still, Greyhaven still burned above them, but the worst danger had passed. Victor fled into the dark tunnels, furious and exposed, while Mina smiled through tears of relief. Evelyn told Kael that the old builders chose well because he had become the kind of person who could stand in fear and not break. Kael looked at the sealed door, then at Mina and Evelyn, and he finally believed her. He had entered the night as someone lost, and he left it as someone ready to guard the future.